What if the man everyone believed was only good enough to sweep the floors was carrying the one idea that could save an entire company? Why would a father quietly accept being fired without arguing, even when he knew something no one else did? And what could possibly make a powerful CEO realize that the biggest mistake of her career wasn't a failed business decision, but the person she chose to let go? Today's story follows a single dad who spent years cleaning a factory after dark while hiding a dream no one ever cared to see. What happened after he walked out those doors would change far more than one company. It would change the way people looked at those they had always overlooked. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, family, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe. Every evening, long after most employees had driven home, Caleb Mercer unlocked the side entrance of Cross Dynamics Manufacturing with the same worn brass key he'd carried for nearly 8 years. He wasn't an engineer, a manager, or an executive. He was the janitor. Everyone nodded at politely before walking past. His shift always began the same way. He swept the machine shop, emptied overflowing trash bins, polished greasy handrails, and checked every emergency exit before the factory settled into its quiet rhythm. While everyone else saw dirt and broken equipment, Caleb saw patterns. Every strange vibration, every unusual sound, every loose bolt told a story. Hidden inside the bottom drawer of his old cleaning cart rested a grease-stained notebook filled with hand-drawn mechanical sketches. No one had ever asked why. That Monday morning, however, the building felt different. Employees whispered in the hallways. "The new CEO is here. They say she's cutting costs everywhere. Half the departments are terrified." At precisely 9 o'clock, Evelyn Cross stepped into the executive conference room. At only 38, she had already built a reputation for making difficult decisions faster than anyone else in the industry. Investors admired her discipline. Employees respected her intelligence. Few had ever seen her hesitate. "Our company has become inefficient," she announced, studying a screen filled with financial reports. "Every department must justify its existence. Sentiment doesn't keep factories alive." Several department heads exchanged uneasy glances. Within hours, budget reductions spread across the building. Maintenance contracts were canceled. Storage rooms were emptied. Entire support teams disappeared from organizational charts. Late that afternoon, Caleb was quietly called into human resources. Evelyn happened to walk past the open office door, just as the HR manager placed an envelope on the desk. "I'm sorry, Caleb," the woman said, gently. "The janitorial department is being outsourced. Today will be your final shift." Caleb lowered his eyes for a moment before giving a small nod. "I understand." No anger, no raised voice, no argument. As he gathered his belongings, Evelyn noticed the thick notebook sticking out of his worn canvas bag. She picked it up before he could stop her. "What exactly is this?" She flipped through page after page of complicated mechanical drawings, gear ratios, handwritten calculations, and redesigned machine assemblies. Her expression hardened. "You've been spending company time drawing inventions instead of doing your job." Caleb remained calm. "I only worked on those after my shift." Evelyn closed the notebook and handed it back. This factory pays people to solve real problems, Mr. Mercer, not chase impossible ideas." For just a second, Caleb looked as though he wanted to explain something. Instead, he simply accepted the notebook. "I hope the company finds what it's looking for." Without another word, he carried his old toolbox toward the exit. As he reached the security gate, He paused and turned to the guard. "Would it be all right if I came back tomorrow morning?" he asked quietly. "I left one small box in the old machine storage room. I'd like to take it home." The guard frowned. "What kind of box?" Caleb offered a faint smile. "Just something I've been building for a very long time." The following morning, Cross Dynamics looked just as busy as it always had. Forklifts moved across the warehouse. Operators prepared the production lines. Managers reviewed shipment schedules worth millions of dollars. To Evelyn Cross, yesterday's layoffs had been painful but necessary. She believed difficult decisions created stronger companies, and she refused to second-guess herself. At exactly 8:17, a deafening metallic crack echoed across the factory floor. Every machine stopped. Red warning lights flashed above the assembly line. Within seconds, supervisors rushed toward production line 3, the oldest and most important manufacturing system in the building. "What happened?" Evelyn demanded as she arrived. The chief engineer stared at the frozen machine. I don't know." A technician pointed toward the massive drive assembly. The synchronization unit locked up. Everything shut itself down to prevent catastrophic damage. "Can you restart it?" "We've already tried." Another engineer connected diagnostic equipment, while dozens of anxious workers stood silently behind the safety barriers. Minutes passed, then another. Finally, the engineer slowly removed his headset. "It's worse than we thought." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Explain." "The original manufacturer went out of business almost 20 years ago. Replacement components don't exist anymore." Silence filled the room. "How long to repair it?" "No one knows." Production managers exchanged worried looks. If line 3 stays down for a week," one manager said quietly, "we'll miss every government contract scheduled this month." Another added, "The penalties alone could reach several $million." Evelyn refused to let panic spread. "Bring in outside specialists." By noon, experts from 2 engineering firms had examined the machine. Their conclusions were nearly identical. Complete replacement. Estimated cost, tens of millions of dollars. Estimated downtime at least 6 months. The board members listening through a video conference fell silent. One finally spoke. "There has to be someone who knows this equipment." The maintenance supervisor hesitated. "There was someone." Every eye turned toward him. "You mean our retired mechanic?" He slowly shook his head. "No." "The janitor?" Several executives laughed. "The janitor," one repeated. "He cleaned floors." The supervisor didn't smile. "He cleaned floors because that's what he was hired to do." He walked toward a dusty maintenance cabinet and opened an old inspection binder. Every page contained handwritten notes. Small adjustments. Strange vibration warnings. Temperature changes. Lubrication schedules that no engineer had ever officially recorded. Each note ended with the same initials. C. Caleb Mercer inspected this machine every night after everyone went home. The supervisor explained. Whenever he noticed something unusual, he'd leave notes for us. An engineer flipped through the pages. "These predictions." He looked up in disbelief. "They're accurate." The supervisor nodded. He understood this machine better than anyone I've ever met. Evelyn's expression remained unreadable. "Then why wasn't he working in engineering?" No one answered. Because no one had ever asked. The room fell quiet once more. Finally, the oldest technician in the factory took a slow breath before speaking. "If there's anyone still alive who understands how this machine thinks, He looked directly at Evelyn. You two, it's the man who walked out of this building carrying a worn notebook yesterday. Caleb's house sat on a quiet street, nearly 30 minutes from the factory. It was small, weathered, and in constant need of repairs, but every room carried signs of careful hands rather than expensive furniture. A bicycle leaned against the front porch. A flower box, built from reclaimed wood, rested beneath the kitchen window. Inside, 10-year-old Noah Mercer looked up from the dining table as his father walked through the door carrying his toolbox. You got home early, Noah said. Caleb forced a smile. I guess I'll be home a little earlier from now on. Noah studied his father's face. You lost your job? It wasn't a question. Caleb slowly nodded. I'm sorry. Noah stood and wrapped his arms around him. It's okay, Dad. Those 3 simple words nearly broke him. After dinner, Caleb disappeared into the garage, claiming he wanted to organize old tools before looking for new work. In reality, he simply needed somewhere quiet to think. The garage was filled with shelves of worn machine parts, salvaged bearings, discarded gears, and carefully labeled containers that most people would have considered junk. To Caleb, each piece still had potential. He switched on an old work lamp and opened the grease-stained notebook Evelyn had dismissed only a day earlier. His fingers paused over a page covered in detailed sketches. A whisper escaped before he realized he had spoken aloud. We almost finished it. Behind him, the garage door creaked. Noah stepped inside. I wasn't trying to spy. Caleb smiled gently. You don't have to apologize. The boy looked around the room. I've never seen all of this before. You weren't supposed to. Noah carefully picked up a small brass gear resting on the workbench. It looks important. It is. What does it do? Caleb hesitated. For years, I dreamed about building a machine that could reduce waste without slowing production. Something simple enough that smaller factories could actually afford. You invented it. I tried. He opened another notebook. Inside were hundreds of pages filled with calculations, corrections, and handwritten notes stretching back more than a decade. Noah's eyes widened. You did all this by yourself? Mostly. There was a long silence before the boy asked the question Caleb had been avoiding for years. Why didn't you ever finish? Caleb lowered his eyes toward a faded family photograph sitting beside the workbench. In it, his late wife, Hannah, smiled while holding a much younger Noah. But because life changed, he didn't say more. He didn't need to. Noah quietly understood. Medical bills. Hospital visits, long nights, dreams postponed one decision at a time. While Caleb carefully returned the notebooks to the shelf, a thin envelope slipped onto the floor. Noah picked it up. Across the front, in bold black letters, were the words, United States Patent Application. The envelope had never been sealed. Caleb gently took it back. I filled it out years ago. You never mailed it. He slowly shook his head. Some opportunities don't disappear all at once. They just wait until you stop believing they're possible. Noah looked at his father for a long moment before unfolding a piece of paper from his own school backpack. It was a colorful blueprint for his upcoming science fair. I was hoping you'd help me build this. For the first time since leaving the factory, Caleb smiled without forcing it. I'd like that very much. Outside, the evening rain began tapping softly against the garage roof. Neither of them noticed that, just a few miles away, Cross Dynamics was preparing for another day of failure, still unaware that the answers they desperately needed had been sitting for years inside a forgotten garage. By Thursday morning, Cross Dynamics no longer felt like a company. It felt like a hospital waiting for bad news. The once steady rhythm of the factory had been replaced by silence. Conveyor belts stood motionless beneath bright overhead lights. Idle workers gathered in small groups, whispering about cancelled orders and uncertain futures. Inside the executive conference room, tension hung in the air. The first consulting firm presented its findings. The synchronization assembly has suffered irreversible internal damage, the lead engineer explained, while displaying a three-dimensional model on the screen. Our recommendation is a complete replacement. How long? Evelyn asked. 6 to 8 months. And the cost? The engineer hesitated. Approximately $23 million. Nobody spoke. The second consulting firm arrived that afternoon. Their recommendation was nearly identical. The machine is simply too old, another specialist concluded. It was never designed to operate this long. After they left, Evelyn stood alone beside the conference room window overlooking the quiet factory floor. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. She replayed every decision she had made since becoming CEO. The layoffs, the budget reductions, the outsourced maintenance contracts. Had she been decisive? Or simply too quick? A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Marcus Hill, the plant's operations director. "I've been reviewing maintenance records," he said, placing several thick binders on the table. "I thought you should see these." Evelyn opened the first binder. Each page contained handwritten notes dated over several years. Bearing temperature increasing. Unusual vibration at 2:13. Replace seal before winter humidity. Monitor synchronization timing. Every observation was remarkably precise. None of them had been written by the engineering department. At the bottom of each page appeared the same initials. C.M. Caleb Mercer, Marcus said quietly. No, he wasn't required to do any of this. Evelyn slowly turned another page. Every warning had eventually become a documented repair. Every prediction had proven correct. He saw problems months before anyone else did. Marcus continued. He never asked for recognition. He'd just leave the notes on my desk before going home. Evelyn closed the binder. Why wasn't he promoted? Marcus gave a tired smile. Because nobody thought to ask why a janitor understood industrial machinery. His answer lingered in the room. Late that evening, Evelyn requested access to the factory's archived security footage. Hours of recordings flashed across the monitor. Most showed nothing unusual. Cleaning, night inspections, empty hallways. Then, one recording caught her attention. 2 weeks before the breakdown, Caleb stood beside production line 3, holding his old flashlight. He wasn't cleaning. He was listening. He placed one hand against the machine's steel housing and closed his eyes as if trying to hear something hidden beneath the noise. A moment later, he pulled a small notebook from his pocket, wrote several lines, then looked toward the manager's office. He took one step forward. Stopped! Slowly folded the notebook closed, then quietly walked away. Evelyn leaned closer to the screen. Zoom in. The technician enlarged the image. Caleb's final glance wasn't one of curiosity. It was concern. He had known something was wrong, and for reasons no one yet understood. He had never been given the chance to make anyone listen. Evelyn stared at the frozen image until the room fell completely silent. For the first time since firing him, she found herself asking a question she could no longer ignore. What if the most qualified person in the entire company had been carrying a mop instead of an executive title? Saturday morning arrived beneath gray skies and a steady drizzle. Evelyn Cross drove herself instead of using the company car. For the first time in years, she didn't want to arrive looking like a CEO. She wanted answers. The GPS guided her into a quiet neighborhood, where modest brick homes lined both sides of the street. Children's bicycles rested in front yards. Wind chimes swayed gently beneath covered porches. She stopped in front of a small house where an old pickup truck sat beside a neatly repaired wooden fence. Nothing about the place suggested the home of someone capable of solving a multi-million-dollar engineering crisis. She knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened. Noah looked up at her. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Caleb Mercer." Before the boy could answer, Caleb appeared behind him. For a brief moment, surprise crossed his face. Then it disappeared. "Mr. Mercer," Evelyn began quietly. "May I come in?" He hesitated before stepping aside. The living room was simple but warm. Bookshelves filled one wall. A small model engine sat on a coffee table beside scattered science fair supplies. Noah excused himself and disappeared upstairs, sensing the conversation wasn't meant for him. Neither adult spoke for several seconds. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "The factory is still down?" Caleb nodded. "I heard. We've brought in specialists from across the country." "I'm sure you have." "They couldn't fix it." Caleb looked out the rain-speckled window. "I'm sorry to hear that." Evelyn studied him carefully. "You already knew something was wrong with that machine." "He didn't deny it." "I noticed changes." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" A faint, tired smile crossed his face. "I tried." He walked toward a shelf and picked up a small notebook. "I left reports. I made recommendations. I asked supervisors to inspect the synchronization unit." He gently placed the notebook on the table. "Eventually, you stop repeating yourself when no one believes the janitor." Evelyn lowered her eyes. She remembered the notebook she had dismissed only days earlier. "I made a mistake." Caleb didn't answer. "I judged you without asking who you were." Still silence. "I came here to ask for your help." Caleb took a slow breath before speaking. "If I return and—" He paused. "Will anyone actually listen this time?" "They will. Or will they listen only until the crisis is over?" The question landed harder than Evelyn expected, because she didn't immediately know the answer. Caleb folded his hands together. "I don't hate your company. I don't even hate you. I've spent too many years fixing broken things to enjoy watching anything fail." He looked toward the staircase where Noah's footsteps could be heard overhead. "But every time someone says, 'We should have listened,' they're really talking about something much older than one machine." Evelyn quietly nodded. "I understand." Caleb gently shook his head. "No. You understand the cost. You don't understand the feeling." Another long silence settled between them. Finally, Evelyn stood. "I won't pressure you." She walked toward the front door before stopping. "If you were in my position—" She turned back. "Ah! Would you help?" Caleb looked at the brass gear resting on the bookshelf. His eyes lingered there for several seconds. "When people throw something away," he said softly, "the easiest choice is to leave it where it landed." He met Evelyn's eyes. "The harder choice." He stopped before finishing the sentence. Evelyn waited. but the words never came. She quietly thanked him and stepped back into the rain, carrying far more uncertainty than when she had arrived. Inside the house, Caleb remained standing beside the window. Then, almost unconsciously, he reached for the old brass gear. For the first time in years, he turned it slowly in his hand. Monday morning arrived with another emergency board meeting. The production floor remained silent. Each hour the factory stood idle. Another contract slipped closer to cancellation. News of the shutdown had already reached several major clients, and investors were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Evelyn listened as department heads argued over temporary solutions. Can we redesign the production line? Or no. What about importing replacement parts? They haven't been manufactured in nearly 2 decades. The room fell quiet again. Finally, Evelyn pushed her chair back. I'm going to ask Caleb Mercer one more time. No one objected. Less than an hour later, Caleb walked through the factory gates for the first time since his dismissal. Not as an employee, simply as a visitor. Some workers greeted him with quiet smiles. Others looked away, embarrassed that they had never paid much attention to the man who had cleaned around them every night. Marcus met him near production line 3. Thank you for coming. I'm only here to look, Caleb replied calmly. I haven't promised anything. The massive machine stood exactly where he had left it. Dust had already begun collecting on the motionless conveyor. Caleb slowly circled the equipment, running his fingertips across the steel housing. He paused every few feet, listening instead of speaking. He crouched beside the synchronization assembly. Then he frowned. Who removed this? Marcus looked confused. Removed what? Caleb pointed toward a narrow mounting bracket hidden behind a protective cover. There used to be a secondary safety regulator here. Several engineers leaned closer. One of them shook his head. There isn't one listed in the official drawings. There was, Caleb answered quietly. It wasn't part of the original design. Everyone looked at him. I built it. Silence spread across the factory floor. Years earlier, Caleb had noticed that repeated vibration placed enormous stress on the aging synchronization system. Since replacement parts were impossible to obtain, he had quietly designed a small mechanical regulator that absorbed the excess force before it reached the main assembly. Marcus suddenly remembered. I approved that modification years ago. Caleb nodded. It kept the machine running. An engineer examined the empty mounting points. But where is it now? Nobody answered until Evelyn spoke. I think I know. She turned toward the finance director. 3 months ago, we ordered every unofficial modification removed during the maintenance cost review. The director slowly lowered his eyes. We wanted every machine returned to factory specifications. Caleb didn't sound angry. Factory specifications worked 20 years ago. They don't always survive 20 more. A heavy silence settled over everyone. For the first time since becoming CEO, Evelyn realized the breakdown had not been caused by age alone. It had been caused by a decision. Her decision. She looked at Caleb. Can another regulator be built? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the old maintenance storage room at the end of the building. The same room he had asked to visit on the day he was fired. He unlocked a dented metal cabinet hidden behind stacks of unused equipment. Inside sat a small wooden box covered with years of dust. Carefully, he lifted it onto a nearby workbench. The lid creaked as it opened. Nestled inside worn cloth lay a beautifully machined brass mechanism, its gears polished by hand. Every tooth, perfectly aligned despite its age. The surrounding engineers stared without speaking. Caleb gently picked it up. "I was hoping," he said softly, "I'd never need to use this." The brass regulator rested in Caleb's hands like something far more valuable than metal. Every engineer gathered around the workbench, studying its intricate design. The mechanism was surprisingly simple, yet every curve and every gear served a purpose. One young engineer finally broke the silence. "You built this by yourself?" Caleb smiled faintly. "No." The room looked confused. "I built the first version alone." He looked around the factory floor. But keeping it alive took everyone. Marcus nodded knowingly. He'd leave instructions for every shift. None of us realized we were following his design. Caleb carefully placed the regulator beside the open machine. "We're not installing the old one." Several faces showed surprise. "It survived this long," an engineer argued. "It deserves to stay." Caleb gently shook his head. "No. This one belongs in a museum." He opened his grease-stained notebook. "We're going to build a better version." The engineers exchanged uncertain glances. "We don't have weeks," one said. "You won't need weeks." Caleb turned several pages until he found updated drawings covered with fresh calculations. "I never stopped improving it." Evelyn watched quietly from a distance. Only days earlier, she had dismissed those very sketches as meaningless doodles. Now an entire engineering department leaned over them with complete attention. For the first time since becoming CEO, she understood that titles had blinded her more than experience ever had. Caleb divided the work naturally. "Sarah, machine the outer housing." She blinked. "Will you know my name?" "You've been running the CNC station for 6 years. He turned. "David, you'll handle heat treatment. You've always had the steadiest hands." Then toward another technician. Emily, check every bearing tolerance before assembly. You're the only person here patient enough to catch mistakes everyone else misses." The room came alive. Nobody questioned his instructions. Not because he demanded authority, but because he noticed people. Throughout the afternoon, sparks flew beneath welding torches while precision lathes hummed back to life. Caleb never once reached for the spotlight. Instead, he moved from station to station, teaching, correcting, encouraging. When one apprentice accidentally ruined a freshly machined gear, the young man lowered his head in embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I just wasted hours." Caleb picked up the damaged piece. "No. You bought yourself experience." He handed him another unfinished blank. "Let's make the next one together." Nearby, Evelyn quietly watched the exchange. She realized she had spent years measuring employees by productivity reports. Caleb measured them by potential. Late that evening, Noah arrived carrying a paper bag filled with homemade sandwiches. "I figured everybody forgot dinner." Laughter spread across the workshop. Within minutes, mechanics, engineers, electricians, and supervisors gathered around folding tables, sharing food like old friends. For the first time since the shutdown, hope felt stronger than fear. As the night stretched on, the final regulator slowly took shape. Just before midnight, Caleb wiped the grease from his hands and carefully lifted the finished component. He examined every surface beneath the bright workshop lights before giving one quiet nod. "It's ready." Around him, dozens of tired faces held their breath. Tomorrow morning, they would discover whether weeks of uncertainty and years of forgotten work had been enough. At 6:45 the next morning, the entire factory gathered around production line 3. No one had been asked to come. They simply showed up. Machine operators stood beside welders. Accountants quietly watched from the back. Even office assistants who had never stepped onto the production floor before waited silently behind the safety railings. The newly built regulator rested inside the open synchronization housing. Caleb knelt beside the machine one final time. His old flashlight illuminated the narrow compartment as he inspected every bolt, every bearing, and every gear. Satisfied, he closed the access panel and slowly stood. Marcus looked at him. "Ready?" Caleb nodded once. "As ready as we'll ever be." The room fell completely silent. Marcus turned the master key. The first relay clicked. Nothing happened. A second later, the hydraulic pumps awakened with a low hum. Pressure gauges climbed. Electric motors began turning. Everyone watched the synchronization assembly. The new regulator rotated once, twice, then settled into a perfectly balanced rhythm. A conveyor belt rolled forward. Another motor answered. One by one, lights across the production line changed from red to green. The machine had come back to life. For several seconds, no one moved. It almost felt too impossible to believe. Then the first finished component emerged from the end of the conveyor. A young operator stared at it before breaking into a wide grin. "It worked!" Applause erupted across the factory. Workers embraced one another. Some laughed. Others wiped tears from tired eyes after days of uncertainty. Evelyn stood perfectly still. Her attention wasn't on the machine. It was on Caleb. While everyone celebrated around him, he quietly picked up a wrench from the floor and returned it to the toolbox. Then, he grabbed an oil-stained cloth and began wiping fingerprints from the machine's steel housing. Marcus laughed. "You know everyone is cheering because of you." Caleb smiled without looking up. "They're cheering because the line is running. That's what matters." Nearby, the young apprentice who had ruined the first gear the night before approached nervously. "I thought you'd want this." He held out the damaged gear. Caleb examined it for a moment before handing it back. "Keep it!" The young man looked confused. "As a reminder." Caleb shook his head. "As proof." "My proof of what?" "That mistakes aren't the end of good work." The apprentice carefully slipped the gear into his pocket. Across the room, Noah rushed toward his father. "I knew you could do it." Caleb knelt and hugged his son tightly. "We did it." Noah looked around at the engineers and mechanics smiling nearby. "Oh." He smiled even wider. "We all did it." Caleb nodded proudly. "Exactly." Evelyn quietly walked toward the workbench where the old grease-stained notebook still lay open. She gently turned its pages. Each sketch was dated. Each revision reflected years of patient improvement. There were no signatures asking for credit. No notes demanding recognition. Only one sentence appeared beneath the final drawing. "The best machines aren't built by one person. They're built by people willing to keep improving together." Evelyn closed the notebook carefully. For the first time in her career, she realized that leadership wasn't about always having the best answers. Sometimes, it was about finally listening to the people no one else had noticed. 3 days later, the factory was running at full capacity again. The panic had disappeared. Delivery trucks rolled out of the loading docks on schedule. Workers who had feared losing their jobs were smiling once more, and the constant hum of machinery had returned like the heartbeat of the building itself. Inside the boardroom, however, Another important decision was waiting. The directors, investors, and senior managers sat around the long conference table as Evelyn Cross stood near the front of the room. Caleb occupied the same chair where he had received his termination notice only a week earlier. The difference was impossible to ignore. This time, everyone waited for him to speak first. Evelyn looked around the room before breaking the silence. Last week, we lost sight of what this company was built on. She paused, and I led us in the wrong direction. Several board members lowered their eyes. We measured people by job titles. We assumed knowledge belonged only to those with certain offices and certain degrees. She turned toward Caleb. I owe you an apology not only for firing you, but for never asking who you really were. The room remained completely still. Caleb accepted her words with a quiet nod. Thank you. There was no anger in his voice. No satisfaction. Only peace. Evelyn picked up a folder from the table. The board of directors has unanimously approved an offer. She slid the folder toward him. Well, we want you to become Chief Innovation Engineer. A generous salary. Full executive benefits. A private office. A signing bonus larger than Caleb had earned in several years. Several executives smiled confidently. Surely no one would refuse. Caleb slowly opened the folder. He read every page without speaking. Finally, he closed it again. I'm honored. A brief silence followed. But I can't accept. Confused murmurs spread around the room. One director leaned forward. May I ask why? Caleb rested his hands on the table. When I cleaned this building every night, I met people no one noticed. The janitors. The mechanics. The forklift operators. The maintenance crews. He smiled gently. They solve problems every single day. They simply aren't invited into rooms like this. The board members listened without interruption. If I become another executive... He looked around the polished conference room. I'll spend my life discussing ideas. He glanced toward the factory windows. I'd rather spend it helping people discover they already have them. He reached into his worn canvas bag and unfolded Noah's colorful science fair blueprint. My son asked me something a few nights ago. Why do only engineers get to invent things? Caleb looked back at Evelyn. I didn't have a good answer. So I'd like to build something instead. He slid a single handwritten proposal across the table. Across the top were 5 simple words. Mercer Innovation Workshop. A place where every employee can bring an idea. No titles. No reserved parking spaces. No one ignored because of the uniform they wear. Engineers could work beside janitors. Managers beside electricians. Interns beside machinists. Anyone willing to learn would have a seat. The room fell silent once again. This time, it wasn't because people were shocked. It was because they were imagining what the company could become. Evelyn slowly picked up the proposal. She smiled for the first time in days. Then she looked toward Caleb. If we build this... She paused thoughtfully. Wuske, will you help lead it? Caleb looked through the boardroom window toward the busy factory floor, where dozens of ordinary people were already solving tomorrow's problems without realizing it. He smiled softly. His answer would shape far more than a single company. 6 months later, Cross Dynamics looked like a different company. The changes weren't immediately visible in the machines or the buildings. They were visible in the people. Every Friday afternoon, one corner of the old maintenance warehouse transformed into the Mercer Innovation Workshop. Folding tables replaced executive desks, Whiteboards filled with sketches covered the walls. Welders stood beside accountants. Electricians exchanged ideas with software engineers. New employees worked alongside veterans who had spent decades inside the factory. No one asked what title a person held before listening to an idea. That rule belonged to Caleb. He never accepted the executive office that had been prepared for him. Instead, he converted the small room next to the workshop into a shared design space where anyone could sit, draw, build, or simply ask questions. One afternoon, Evelyn quietly stepped inside. She found Caleb helping a young janitor modify a broken conveyor sensor using inexpensive recycled parts. The young man looked nervous. "I don't know if this idea is good enough." Caleb smiled as he handed him a pencil. Good ideas aren't born finished. They become good because someone cares enough to improve them. Evelyn remained by the doorway, saying nothing. She had heard many motivational speeches throughout her career. None had ever sounded as honest as that simple sentence. A few weeks later, Noah proudly carried his science fair project into the local middle school gymnasium. His display wasn't the most expensive. It wasn't the flashiest either. But every moving part worked perfectly. When the judges asked who had designed it, Noah smiled. "My dad showed me something more important than the answer." "What was that?" one judge asked. "He taught me how to keep asking better questions." The project earned first place. That evening, Noah placed the blue ribbon on the kitchen table before hugging his father. "We really did build it together." Caleb laughed softly. "We sure did." Back at Cross Dynamics, another quiet tradition had begun. The old brass regulator, the original prototype Caleb had protected for years, was no longer hidden inside a dusty storage cabinet. It rested inside a simple glass display near the factory entrance. Beside it sat the grease-stained notebook that had once been mistaken for a distraction. A small plaque carried only a few words. "Great ideas don't always wear expensive suits." Employees passed it every morning. Some barely glanced at it. Others paused for a moment before beginning their shifts. Not because it celebrated one man, because it reminded everyone that talent could be found anywhere if people cared enough to look. As the afternoon sun streamed through the factory windows, Evelyn stood beside the display one last time before walking toward the production floor. Workers greeted one another by name. Suggestions filled the workshop walls. Laughter echoed where silence had once lived. The company had recovered. More importantly, its people had finally learned that the strongest machines were never the ones built from steel alone. They were the ones built from trust. Have you ever met someone whose true talents were hidden simply because people judged them by their job title? Or have you ever felt overlooked, even though you knew you had more to give? We'd love to hear your story in the comments because someone reading it today may need the encouragement only you can offer. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not just for the work they do. Remember, kindness costs nothing. Respect changes lives. And sometimes the greatest ideas come from the quietest people in the room. We'll see you in the next story.